welcome back to another episode of the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast. And more importantly, welcome back to another episode of the Future of Canadian Optometry series presented by Aqueous Pharma here on the 2020 podcast. I am your host, Dr. Harbir Sian. And now if you've been following along with this conversation about the future of Canadian optometry, then you know that these are conversations that I'm having, interviews that I'm conducting with leaders from various organizations within optometry in Canada, and some of the larger organizations, FYI doctors, Iris, lens crafters, Specsavers, of course, being one of the hot topics these days here in Canada. And the goal is to ask these leaders the questions that we would like to ask as optometrists. You know, what is your organization doing to support the profession? What is your organization seeing as the future of optometry in Canada? What do you as an individual see as the future of optometry in Canada? And thankfully, most of the guests have been very candid, including today's guest in the 4th installment of the Future of Optometry in Canada is Mr. Rick Gadd, who is the president of Essilor Canada. And Rick, really, again, being candid and open, does share a lot of insights from his perspective as the head of this gigantic organization. He has overseen so many changes within the industry, including one of the biggest pain points for us in Canada and here, especially in BC, the acquisition of Clearly Contacts many years ago. And so Rick was very gracious in facing these questions head on and giving the best answers that he could. And again, looking at this from now a different perspective as some of the other interviews. For example, businesses like FYI doctors and Iris and lens crafters that have storefronts and conduct business to consumer transactions. Rick is talking about the business to business transactions that he is in charge of on a day-to-day basis, and bringing insights from his experience, extensive experience working in the US and seeing consolidation and private equity and foreign organizations entering the market, and what he sees in Canada as potentially similar experiences or parallels that are currently going on. And don't forget to share that we are having this conversation about the future of Canadian optometry with all of our colleagues across the country. Take a screenshot. If you're on Instagram, throw it up on your story. If you're on LinkedIn, put a link up there. If you're not on social media, send a text message to a friend with a link to the podcast or to YouTube where you can watch these interviews in full. But make sure we are spreading the word and helping our colleagues to be enlightened about this conversation and the important changes that are happening and coming for our profession in the future. Again, this episode here, the 4th installment of the Future of Canadian Optometry series presented by Aqueous Pharma, is with Mr. Rick Gadd, president of Essilor Canada. I hope you love it. Okay, Mr. Rick Gadd, thank you so much for taking the time to join me here on the 2020 podcast for this very important series of discussions, the future of Canadian optometry. Thanks so much for being here.
Harbir, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
So, Rick, as you know, a couple months back, I put a call out on my podcast, on the 2020 podcast, and really an invitation to various organizations that are that have a footprint, small or large, here in Canada in the optometry industry, in the profession. And thankfully, you know, people like yourself have stepped forward to kind of answer that call and come forward and share their perspective on, you know, where our profession's heading, what's happening now, where it's heading. Since that call out, since I put that invitation out there a couple of months back, I've been speaking to a lot of my colleagues across the country, you know, coast to coast, in all sorts of different modalities to try to understand what are their concerns, what are their thoughts about where we are now, you know, taking that sort of national temperature, if you will, of the profession. And of course, these are, I use the word average. I don't like using the word average, but I mean that by like our mainstream, middle of the bell curve optometrists and colleagues, people who are kind of doing their day-to-day working in their clinics. You know, the perspective that you bring, Rick, and many of the other guests that I've brought on for this conversation is a very different perspective, right? You're the leader, you're at the head of one of the large, if not maybe the largest, one of the Goliaths in the industry here as president of Essilor Canada. You bring a very different perspective. So I would, you know, I'd love for you to share as much as you can candidly from that, you know, higher perspective, from a different perspective than most of us optometrists would have. And the first question that I asked with all the guests is this: from your perspective, what is the how would you describe the current state of optometry in Canada?
Well, I think the current state, as I have seen it, and just to, I feel like I'm still learning about the Canadian industry. Just to be fair, I joined officially as leading the Essilor Canada organization officially in the end of March of this year, and I've really had the opportunity, timely as it was, as there were so many meetings going on, everybody was getting back together to meet and talk to a lot of key opinion leaders in the industry, a lot of our customers that we're serving, a lot of the associations. And I would really put it into a few buckets. One, first is that the health of the industry, I think, is quite strong in terms of demand. So we have a strong need, and that continues to be extremely relevant in Canada and across the country. Secondly, I feel that it's an underpenetrated market relative to some of the other markets in the world. So that to me states opportunity. And penetration isn't just necessarily in the number of people who are wearing contacts or eyeglasses, but the breadth of being able to utilize, visual enhancement for different needs, whether it's looking at a computer screen, whether it's being in the outdoors, and whether it's for protective purposes and so forth. I feel like there is opportunity in terms of penetration. The third dimension, though, which I knew of, but I think it's really become quite clear to me, is it's a very attractive marketplace, in the sense of, because and I say the Canadian market has attracted a lot of players, but probably the number of relatively large players who have entered the Canadian market is quite stunning relative to other, and I'll just reference the US because it's an easy reference, that there are some similarities in the market. Less players have entered into Canada from international destinations. And so to me that says a couple things. One is that the barriers to entry may be a little bit less for the Canadian market. But secondly is that, the socioeconomic landscape and the opportunity to market is very attractive. And I always remind all of my peers that Canada is the 10th largest GDP in the world. The only, I suppose, thing that goes against that perhaps is that we just happen to live next door to the largest GDP in the world. So sometimes that gets muted a little bit. Yeah. But I say all that is to say is, I think the fundamentals of the industry are really powerful. What I see is that it's a very dynamic marketplace as a result of there's so many entrants into the market, and that creates a new sense of competitiveness in the marketplace. It also creates potentially both opportunities, but of course risks for others that we will all have to change our approach in order to not just survive but thrive in this very dynamic market.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you touched on it a little bit. I'm curious because I've heard this now a lot as I've been having these conversations, that Canada, for some reason, the Canadian optical market, eye care market, is very attractive to foreign or other just forms of, whether it's private equity, whether it's foreign organizations. So what is it about that? What is it about Canada in particular that you feel like that somebody else would want to? And of course, we can kind of point out the elephant in the room here. A lot of these discussions that are happening now are Specsavers coming to Canada, and they're making a big splash. For better or for worse, that's just the way it is. And so, I'm asking the question of Specsavers as well. Why is it like you've been eyeing Canada for so many years? I'm curious, Rick, from your perspective now, from the few months that you've been here, back in Canada, what is it that you think is creating that desirability?
Well, I think, you know, again, it comes back to some of the maybe the structural things and some of the sort of fundamental characteristics of the market itself. Is Canada is very stable politically. You know, it's a wealthy country, and so people have, and then I think thirdly, and maybe uniquely, is that healthcare in Canada is very unique compared to perhaps other marketplaces. That the awareness is there in terms of healthcare, and I really view vision care as part of healthcare in many dimensions. So I think that's also an area that creates an attractiveness. But there's something that's really sort of fundamental, Harbir, is that there has been a premiumness in the market. We see it in our own numbers, and when we measure, Canadians by and large tend to shop a little more premium. And I'm going to get really specific about spectacles and brands. Apparel brands and so forth. Canada is very premium in terms of their desire to really, I don't know how else to say it, but look good and feel good in what they're wearing, and so that in itself is attractive, I think, to many entrants into the market. And then the last thing I'll say is that when they benchmark when all of us benchmark the penetration in the market, we see that there is opportunity in terms of not just to share grab, but to in fact grow the entire marketplace. We see the regularity in terms of eyewear purchase relative to some other markets feel like that creates opportunity. So there's a number of different dimensions there, and hopefully I'm getting to some of the core of your question.
Yeah, no, actually, there's no specific direction that or answer that I'm looking for. You have, again, that unique perspective from your position. You know, I'd like to hear from that. When I ask that question from other guests, they'll give me their perspective, of course. You know, you mentioned penetration a couple of times. Do you feel like there's a large portion of the population that's underserved?
So when I look at statistically, I think, you know, obviously there are gaps in terms of access. And you know, Canada also, again, has incredible density around urban areas, disproportionately around urban areas. But there are a lot of rural areas that are not appropriately addressed. And that probably has something to do with the penetration, the regularity of a comprehensive eye exam, so many different dimensions. Again, we can tie that back to healthcare and access as an opportunity in the Canadian marketplace. But I think even in the urban centers, there aren't as many triggers in terms of that annual comprehensive eye exam that may exist in some other markets. And so that leads to penetration and regularity of purchase, I think, also. And then finally, I think there are still multi-pair opportunities, and you know, I'm speaking from the perspective of a company who's a spectacle lens company is at its root, and so we see that in terms of performance and situational, as well as fashion opportunities. That it's not there. People just don't have as many pairs of glasses in Canada as they do in perhaps some other markets.
Okay. So again, with various forces coming in from whether it's internally or coming from other countries, there's been a fair amount of disruption, generally speaking. I'm curious, in your mind, how you would describe disruption in our industry, or what forms of disruption you've seen?
Well, I think that you know, there's the obvious one of private equity entering into the market, and through consolidation that creates one level of disruption. And when I speak about that, I mean, we can go back to when this was purely an independent marketplace. We could go back into, you know, the 90s, when it was largely speaking, there were no chains to speak of. But as we progress, I think the acceleration, again, I'll start with the point is that the fundamentals of this, of our industry as a whole, whether you're in Canada or the US and many other markets, is very attractive. And private equity, you know, identifies markets where they think that they can create efficiencies. and in fact benefit their shareholders or themselves in terms of creating those efficiencies. I'm probably stating the obvious, but there is a very fragmented industry historically that's created some opportunities that have been ideal for that. So what does that mean practically as far as disruption is concerned? Well, I think there's always two sides to every coin, and on the one hand, I think it elevates the awareness. We see more communication. We see more advertising. It's more organized in terms of communicating more from a commercial sense is point one. So that can actually elevate the awareness. And I think that can be a positive as far as the disruption is concerned. Obviously, there is the other side of the coin for a independent optometrist with their own practice, private practice. Is that the level of competition, their ability to compete, becomes a more challenging environment in some cases. And so I think that in itself, that's one level of disruption that we're going through right now that we continue to experience. The second level of disruption is technology, for sure, and I feel like optometry has lagged, perhaps in other industries in terms of the utilization of technology to streamline business and business models, to attract, engage, and retain patients and consumers. So that level of disruption is accelerating as well too. And we could talk about Tele Optometry and what role it'll play going forward as an example. Certainly e-commerce later in terms of the engagement into our industry, but now very much a percentage, and I don't know the exact percentage that e-commerce represents as far as purchases are concerned in Canada, but I think in the US it's roughly around 10% now of eyewear purchases. So that's another level of technology disruption, but it's also following the path of what consumers are seeking in terms of choice. So I think that those, and then finally I would say the other level of disruption is that what we've gone from. And I'll speak from a company that is largely anchored on innovation. Is that we've gone from correction and then protection and then prevention, but now to therapeutic lenses. So I think that the scope of the practice has also gone in terms of disruption more and more medically oriented and more integrated. And what I'm speaking about very specifically is myopia and myopia management through therapeutic lenses, whether it's contact lens, whether it's drops, or whether it is obviously spectacle lenses. So those are areas of disruption, and disruption doesn't necessarily always mean a negative thing. It just means how do we adjust in order to either capitalize on the opportunity or how do we adjust in terms of minimizing the risk?
Yeah, the word disruption tends to have kind of a negative connotation, generally speaking, right? So, I mean, just a kind of an obvious question for you, though, does it have to be negative? I mean, are there positive forms of disruption, or how do we see it? How do we make it so the disruption can be positive?
Yeah, I think it can be extremely positive. One, I think competitiveness in general always challenges all of us to up our game, so to speak. We need to continue to innovate, whether it's how we're attracting, retaining our patients, the patient journey in the practice, or whether it's that we need to change our scope of practice through innovation. And I'm going to deviate for a second because it helps me a little bit to kind of sort of rationalize what we're going through from a reference point that when I was growing up, my dad, who's well retired, as you can well imagine, but he was a veterinarian in Toronto, and so he was in private practice his entire life. And innovation back then was when big box like Petco and PetSmart came on the scene, that was hugely disruptive for them, and they had to reinvent their practice, because what was a key source of seeing patients, attracting patients, was an annual vaccination of the dog or cat. They had to find new ways of bringing in new services into the practice in order to continue to retain and attract new patients, perhaps, and patients that had a high value. My dad, at like 58 years old, went back to dentistry school, because dentistry was something that they felt that in the practice could be valuable. And so I give that as there was a disruption. They decided we need to change the scope of practice. They educated themselves, and then they went back out, and it was a very, very positive and additive to the practice. So it's completely outside but I think it's super relevant in terms of when I think about disruption. And by the way, that dental became a very significant part of their practice. One, two, the margins were way better on dental than they were on doing vaccinations. And patients oriented themselves with well, I shouldn't say patients, but the pet owners oriented themselves to where they needed to go for the service that they want. So I think that's an example of disruption that can end up in a positive outcome.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think often the concern is when there's disruption, it's sort of this sky is falling sort of mentality that like this is going to be the end of the profession. Yeah. But often we end up, like you said, pivoting, evolving, however you want to phrase it, and hopefully coming out better if we're doing the right thing.
Yes.
So you have this perspective, of course, from the US. You can make some comparisons with our industry in particular. Private equity, as you mentioned, is a big force now in Canada, but it's not new in the US. You've seen various large organizations now formed through private equity. Would you say, overall, in your opinion, as much as you're comfortable sharing it, has it been beneficial for the industry? Has it been negative? Has everything sort of just come to some sort of equilibrium after a few years?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I think overall, so let me speak again to what I think has been really positive, is that it has challenged all of us, all participants in the industry, to evaluate our business models and find ways of creating new value. So we serve the entire market as Essilor Luxottica. But I think we evaluate how can we create value for each one of our stakeholders that's going to be meaningful for them. And so from our perspective, and it's hard for me to speak in terms of our competitors and so forth, what we see is every single year the industry continues to grow. And I think that's a positive outcome. I think, secondly, with these well-organized businesses that are private equity backed, and there are many different players. There's everyone from small boutique kind of private equity players to large ones like Goldman Sachs, as you well know. With my eye doctor is a great example of if a Goldman Sachs finds our industry interesting, that says something. Yeah. KKR. Others, I mean, there's some very, very substantial private equity institutions that find it interesting. And I think that again, there's the net effect. There have been those practices and doctors who have found that the timing was good for them to exit their practice and play a different role. So I think it created an opportunity for them, of course, and that's stating the obvious. But I think that there are also some other doctors who have found that they are more focused on the clinical aspect of their practice and really where they wanted to focus versus the soup to nuts truly independent practice where they're managing all aspects of the practice. And I think that's certainly been an opportunity that's been addressed as well too, and has made it attractive to some. That said, I think bottom line is that it creates choice overall, and I don't mean to be ambiguous in terms of saying is this good or bad. I think overall it's good. It's a natural evolution of business. We've seen it in other industries. Look at dental. Look at some of the. Dermatology. I mean, you can go down the list of other professional services and solutions that private equity has been active in, but we see the bottom line is what I see is that a greater awareness There has been greater by patients and consumers in general. That's a very positive outcome. Where has it been a negative? I would say that the greatest challenges for independent optometrists, truly, I want to stay independent. I want to own my practice end to end, is that they need to seek out partners to help them succeed in a much more competitive environment. And that's a reality. Absolutely. And how do I distinguish myself when I've got this marketing prowess and presence in the market? How do I elevate my voice as an independent optometrist? These are all things that I think have a negative potential outcome for an independent, but at the same time, there are means and ways to, in fact, reinforce. I'll use this term, I guess, a couple of times. It's not only survive but thrive, because they're through the specialization and differentiation.
Got it. I think I should clarify just for people who are listening and watching, just in case I haven't already. But Rick, your position, EssilorLuxottica, your position is not consumer facing, right? So, other guests that I've had on are, the head of FYI doctors or whatever. They have their banner stores that they're, I think many guests, or excuse me, listeners are probably thinking of. And your position is a bit unique in the series of conversations, because your entity that you're at the top of is actually dealing with the businesses themselves, that side of EssilorLuxottica. So you actually have I think a very different, broader perspective because you're working with private practice, you're working, independent, you're working with the private equity type of organizations, you're working with these other large players, right? So you kind of had that, just to kind of clarify for everyone who's listening and watching, Rick's position here is not the head of LensCrafters stores. It's the other side of the business.
Yes, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, that's I probably will make that again, just to make sure everyone's on the same page here. But now, some tough questions for you, Rick. We've talked about this before, and I know you're keenly aware of our feelings here, especially in BC, of clearly contacts. And so, whatever, a decade plus ago, there was this big disruption, big deregulation here. Clearly essentially infiltrated the government and had things changed to their benefit, which ultimately, from my perspective, was to the detriment of the profession. And then some years later, Essilor had acquired Clearly for a large sum of money. Now, first I want to ask you, from your understanding, from your experience, what was the Canadian sentiment towards Essilor at that time? And then now, a few years later, do you feel like that's shifted, and what is it now?
Let's say I give you my perspective. I wasn't involved in the transaction, but I was with Essilor of America at that time when the acquisition was done, and just maybe a lot of people might say, why did you do it? And honestly, Essilor, and it was not EssilorLuxottica at the time; it was Essilor. Did the acquisition, as you know. Had no e-commerce strategy, but as a whole, we saw e-commerce starting to really elevate, and it was an opportunity that was presented. So that's really the background behind it. And honestly, Harbir, as a company, we felt that we could be good stewards. We thought about, where else, because it was clear that Clearly was going to be sold, and we felt that we could be good stewards of that acquisition. One can argue whether or not we have been, but nonetheless, the intention was to acquire this, to start to learn at a very basic sense about e-commerce and determine what our role should be going forward. So that's the background. My perception is that Essilor was viewed quite commonly as a partner to the independent eye care professional. I'm going to assume that because I wasn't in the Canadian market at that time, but I know what our reputation in the U.S. has and continues to be as a partner for the independent eye care professional. But I do know that there was a reaction to the acquisition, and that it was not necessarily a positive one. And I think that what is some mistakes made along the way. One is that we should have clarified what were our intentions. I think there were some commitments that were made around how we would behave in the marketplace, and certainly that was our intentions to do so. But as I look forward today, here's what I see. I see. E-commerce is a reality, and I think doctors, our customers, understand that it is just part of the business model in the marketplace. Now, do they think that we should be participating? You will get as many answers as you will have individuals who are in the industry. I mean, and some continue to find that unacceptable. And what I would, my response is that we have several lines of business. We're competing with those customers in e-commerce, and of course we own LensCrafters is another example. But what we have tried to do is provide choice at the end of the day. And my job is to create not just a product and service platform around eyeglasses, but in fact to find ways that we can help our customers compete in the marketplace. And that's really what our intention is to do. We want to elevate the entire industry, but we also recognize that consumers will exercise choice. And so as a vertically integrated player, but as a single player, and that's the other thing about EssilorLuxottica is that we don't have any other business. We are wholly into optical. So we if we're not successful in this business, then frankly, we don't have a plan B. We're in optical, and that's all there is to it. So I say that just to say that I've talked to people who including yourself. You started by saying we've had this conversation, who find that's a point of stress in the relationship. I will, say that we communicate regularly back to Clear. We tell them, here are the things that are concerning to our patients, to our customers very specifically, and we try and act as good stewards to creating that connection. So what you and I talked about, I in fact went to the president of Clearly and said, like, here are some concerns that we need to try and work through. So I think that if I can say anything, that's an open line of communication, and and we're vested. I mean, we have to balance all of our business needs, and so it's an important and material conversation in order to have that. So we have a voice, and I guess the second thing I would say is that it's on me and my team and my company to create value that's incremental to just being a transactional relationship that we need to elevate, help you succeed in the marketplace. And the second comment is that we work very hard on doing that, not just through the products and innovation that we provide in terms of the actual material itself, but in the way we support the practices through platforms, marketing platforms, driving traffic to the practice and so forth. So, do I wish that everybody would love us? I absolutely do, because that's I do. It's probably my nature. It's just but it bothers me when people have concerns about me. But again, I in a very pragmatic way, I take the feedback and try and direct it in a positive way that moves our business forward. And I ask, just to be judged. I think then that's the final point is that I feel that's a point of judgment and fair enough. But I would just say then judge all of our competitors in the same way. We all have relationships in the industry. Some of us own certain assets that may be more obvious. At the end of the day, I think you need to, I would ask only that your listeners judge us on terms of the value that we create. And then at the end, it's a very personal choice. And I completely respect that.
What's up, guys? I just wanted to take a minute to give our exclusive partner for the 2020 podcast, the Future of Optometry series, a shout out here, Aqueous Pharma. Aqueous is a Canadian pharmaceutical company with a simple mission. scour the globe for the best products and make them accessible to Canadian ECPs. The Evolve Intensive Gel is an artificial tear containing more drops per bottle than any other brand its size. Each drop is 28 microliters, which is the optimal volume for coating the eye without overflow. Its triple action formula contains sodium hyaluronate at the patient-preferred concentration of 0.2%, pure glycerol, which helps to support the lipid layer of the tear film, which is excellent for MGD patients, and cross-linked carbomer 980 that binds moisture to the ocular surface and extends the drop's residency time. As important as what's in the drop is what is not in the drop. The Evolve Intensive Gel is preservative and buffer-free, avoiding phosphates and citrates, which have been shown to sensitize the human conjunctival and corneal cells. So why do ECPs love partnering with Aqueous? Because they don't sell directly to patients, nor can their products be found in drugstores or at grocers or on Amazon. Patients can only purchase directly from your clinic or your website. Recommending ECP exclusive brands helps to support our profession, helps to build your practice, keeps your margins healthy, and keeps patients within your continuum of care. There has never been a better time to evolve your practice. To request your product samples, contact your Aqueous rep today by emailing contact@aqueouseyecare.ca. That's AEQUUS eyecare.ca. And don't forget to put the 2020 podcast in the subject line so they know you heard about them right here. And now back to this episode of the Future of Canadian Optometry series here on the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast, presented by Aqueous Pharma. Absolutely. And first of all, I'm humbled that after our conversation, you felt compelled to go speak. Let's have that other conversation that clearly. But so, of course, I've seen that whole scenario play out from my own very biased perspective of an independent practice optometrist, or just an optometrist based here in BC. The timing was very unique for me. I graduated in 2010, and as I was coming out to practice, that's when all of that disruption happened. So it was very, very plain for me to see when it happened. But over time, I've realized, and now as we're talking, realize that there's the other aspect of your customers, as you've referred to, a few times now. We talked about your customers are optometrists and other eye care professionals. From that perspective, the acquisition of an e-commerce player, which is technically my competition, it does seem like there's a conflict there, and I can see how that would be difficult for people to reconcile that. So did you have to have that kind of a conversation about, you mentioned, and of course it's a business decision at the end of the day. You're running a business, it's fine, but there seems to be a conflict there. You're serving practitioners like myself, and at the same time you own what is seen to be my competition. How do you reconcile that then?
A few things. One is that I reconcile it by trying to create value every single day to earn your business, to help you succeed in the marketplace. That is my sole motivation, is to be a good partner to you. I think secondly is that we, as far as our participation in the market, and I stated earlier, I mean, we are a vertically integrated player in the market. We have been for a very long time, and that is our part of how we create value in the marketplace. And I would say thirdly is that we cannot ignore that consumers will make choices in the way and how they want to utilize their, how they want to purchase eyewear and contact lenses. Clearly is obviously a very big player in the context of contact lenses in Canada. In the relative sense, a relatively small player, and I don't mean to take anything away from Clearly or their success, is that there are multiple entities that are participating here because consumers ultimately are looking for choices, and we need to, we feel that we need to be there for them at several different junctures. So I think, you know, I'll just leave you with the one thing that there's certain things that we will not compromise. And I think if you look at any of our entities and what that are consumer or patient facing, is the one thing that we is so foundational to us is that a comprehensive eye exam is what we stand for, and we so from a clinical perspective, reusing an old prescription, things of that nature are completely out of bounds. We are committed to a comprehensive eye exam, not just a refraction, a comprehensive eye exam, because it's the cornerstone of healthcare and something that we feel is very, very powerful in differentiating in optometry, and a critical role that optometry plays in the entire healthcare system, not just in terms of you know, eye care, but in terms of disease states that are identified, and you know, that is that's fundamental to the company. It's not just me, it's fundamental to the company. So I would just tell you that there are other players who are less concerned in the industry, that may have e-commerce platforms that are less concerned about that starting point of a comprehensive eye exam, and I think that that's important. And it's also, as we reinforce that, that is an opportunity to engage that customer, that patient, in your practice, wherever they may be. And so, to that end, you know, we it's a balance, and I fully recognize that. But I would say we work very, very hard to keep the fundamentals front and center.
Speaking of comprehensive eye exams, what is it, in your opinion, what forms the perceived value? What factors are involved in a patient's perceived value of the eye exam service? You know, what does, before they walk into a clinic or after they leave it, what do you think helps a patient decide whether they received good value for the service they just had?
It's a super question. I mean, the patient journey in general is differentiated in many different practices, retail locations, etc. But I think the quality of care is the starting point. I think for all of us, it's the quality of care and the sense of quality in terms of that journey from the time that they enter the practice till the time they exit the practice. And I think that there's a high degree of variability that exists today. But I think that what a patient recognizes as the quality of care is the interaction with the doctor, with the staff, with the comprehensiveness in terms of the engagement and the utilization of the technology and the instrumentation that leads to a very positive experience or not positive experience. And that to me, and then coming out with a diagnosis and a plan for their vision is I think it is how value is created on behalf of the patient, and ultimately it's the patient's choice whether or not they act upon that, just like any aspect of healthcare, of course. But the additive there is that really linking the conclusion of the comprehensive eye exam that is very clinically focused, and then translating that into, and here are my recommendations in terms of how to enhance you and protect, prevent, correct, and then ultimately enhance your life through this set of visual solutions for you. So
what role do you think price plays on that perceived value?
But again, a great question. And I'm not so sure that I am qualified to answer a price question, other than to say that I think if the price is too low, then the perception of value goes down. I think if the price is too high, then it feels like access is being challenged. So what's the balance in there? I won't put a dollar figure on it for you, because I don't have a dollar figure.
Well, actually, Rick, that was going to be my next question. So
okay, well,
the question I ask every guest is, how much do you think a high quality comprehensive eye exam should cost? And I understand it's a difficult question, and it's not simply about the number. It's about the conversation that happens after the question's asked. So how much do you think it's worth?
Oh gosh, you're going to put me on the spot. You know, I think that you know, it's 150, 175 for just the initial exam itself is, and then there's adjunct on that as well too. As you identify in pre-screening, there may be areas that you identify that there are incremental tests that are required that obviously should be incremental in terms of the cost associated with it. I think it's the comprehensiveness. So that's why I say it's a little bit hard for me to put an actual dollar figure on it, because it can range. And it also depends on, you know, whether you, and I shouldn't, we always have a bias on the, or at least I have a bias on it anyway. If somebody's young, their health is good, you know, you're less likely to find a disease state. Well, perhaps that it can be a more efficient eye exam. It should be a comprehensive eye exam. There should be imaging associated with it. In order to conclude that there are no disease states that are happening, or there isn't something problematic. But at the same time, somebody my age probably
You're
requires
a young man.
I think so, but nonetheless, I'm not 18. So, you know, and my visual needs have changed over the years, but also things that have been identified along the way. I've really felt powerful, and I'll share with you. I mean, my optometrist identified that I have macular degeneration. It was horrifying to me, but I'm glad he caught it when he caught it. So I can manage it. Now, what's that worth to me? That's worth a lot to me, because I can manage a you know, the state in itself, and it's very, very early stage. So that to me, it's almost like I put value on that. That's incremental. And had I not had that high degree of imaging that was occurring, that would not have been identified. So, so until it was an advanced disease state, and then it's much more difficult to manage. As I'm preaching to the choir, you know way more about this than I do.
No, it's nice to hear your perspective on that. You mentioned you touched on briefly earlier telehealth, tele optometry. That's certainly something I'd like to dig into a little bit. As far as implementation of technology in optometry, telehealth being one, do you see other forms of technology being implemented that will change the way we perform an eye exam?
Yes, I mean, you know, from an instrumentation perspective, I think, you know, the imaging is an area that just has so many possibilities. It's just gotten so much better of course of the years. So I think, you know, just in general, managing disease states and expanding the scope of practice is something that's a real opportunity for optometry. So that's when I think about technology in general, the ability then to also be able to transmit that data in a secure environment, those images that are high quality, high definition, to get timely, perhaps you know, timely expert opinions, real time, as opposed to having to wait for you know, an expert entity to be able to evaluate an image. To me, those are very positive progressions in terms of, you know, our industry and the possibilities to be able to address issues in a much shorter time frame with a great deal of efficiency, and also access. So that's the other area for me that's really important. It's not just access in the sense of being able to get an eye exam, but access to, again, a small pool of experts that can then, in fact, be able to aid the local practice in terms of evaluation, recommendation, and next steps. So I think it's creating a pool and a panel of doctors that are more connected in a very connected world. That seemed to me to be a super powerful opportunity. So that in itself is really interesting. The second part of that is access, though, and you know, we start out talking about rural communities and the ability to access optometrists, and where in some communities where optometrists don't exist. And I think the reach by utilizing technology, teleoptometry, obviously being the kind of the discussion point, is super powerful. powerful. And I think it can be enhancing for the doctor. I think it can be enhancing for the patient for sure. And it opens up new doors in terms of the regularity and interaction. But the one thing I will say is that, but it cannot be compromised, right? So it comes back to a comprehensive eye exam. I do not foresee when I'm using my iPhone today as I talk to you, but I do not see for the foreseeable future where that can replace a comprehensive eye exam. That is just simply ludicrous. That there needs to be that interaction, that evaluation, and the recommendation in terms of expertise that cannot be replaced. Final comment, and then I'll shut up.
I didn't bring you on a podcast to have you shut up.
It's a very rich topic, and one that I find exciting, because the way I think that and I know it's being evaluated by different associations and different recommendations across the country. In Canada, the AOA in the US is also taking a position. I think the CAO is also collaborating in a North America perspective, sharing data and taking a position. But in the end, I had a comprehensive eye exam completed and a pilot that was being run in the U.S. And again, I'm a high touch person, so I really like to see the doctor. I like to see the optician. And I will tell you that I did not feel that I walked away from that having a bad experience. In fact, it was a good experience. But I was talking, just as you and I are talking right now, the doctor was there. They were live. But the most important part, the connectivity through all of this, was the ability that the doctor was in control in this scenario. They were doing the refraction. They were looking at my retinal images. They were pulling them out, and then they walked me through, this is what we saw. This is our recommendation. So, so I think it holds a lot of promise. But again, I said live doctor, right? Is that was the power. If it was something that was where that interaction didn't occur, then I would have seen that was low value, and perhaps I would not have trusted it as much. So I think there's just a lot of potential, and we're in an industry that it's a growing industry. Although there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of need for optometrists, and how do you efficiently have the optometrists in places where they're needed? I think there's just a lot of things that can be done here to really enhance the practice and enhance it for the doctors as well as the patients.
In that scenario where you had that exam, was it foreseeably when it is implemented somewhere, is it a technician that's conducting the tests, and there's a doctor who's watching?
Yeah, it was a pre-screen where a technician did the pre-screen, much the way that you would have one of your staff members doing a pre-screen, and then it went into the exam room, and then there was a technician in the room. The doctor was on the screen, and I was looking at the doctor in front of me, but the doctor was actually remotely controlling the equipment. So it wasn't the technician that was operating the equipment. They weren't saying to the technician to make adjustments. They were actually being able to control it. And that's what I found very reassuring.
And was the retinal evaluation primarily done with the photograph or that kind of digital imaging, or was there any form of live time active?
Mm-hmm. There was live time active viewing. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's very interesting. And as you know, as you stated already earlier, our profession, our industry tends to be quite slow to move on technology, generally speaking. Even if you won't agree with that right now, I will say that very bluntly. When I do lectures on like e-commerce and stuff like that, it's like we are slow to move on a lot of stuff. And when technology like this comes around, where it potentially can improve access, allow greater access to care, it still seems a little scary, and I think there'll still be some amount of pushback, as I imagine you would expect. For a couple of reasons. If I'll share whatever I think, maybe the one is the loss of the accuracy, or the loss of like the technical ability to diagnose, the potential loss. And now you'll say technology is very good, and it catches everything, fantastic. But the second one is the bigger one, and that is that, as you know, artificial intelligence plays a big role already in healthcare. And there's a concern that, well, you got all the technology now, you just implement a little AI, then where does the optometrist really come in on this? Do you think that's something that we have to worry about?
I think it's something that healthcare needs to be cautious of, and I use healthcare as opposed to eye care because I think that every intersection there is always a risk of somebody saying no, AI can take care of everything, but I think that again, that human interaction, the training that has certainly continues to be enhanced through the optometry schools, and the ability to is there a risk in let me recenter on your question, is there a risk? There's always a risk, but I think that that's the important role that the industry holds as a whole. The associations need to stand up for the right things, that when they are interfacing with governmental institutions, that they actually, the government understands exactly what they are speaking about and what the recommendation is and what are the risks associated with it. So that's where I think that, again, each one of the provincial associations of optometry, the Canadian Association of Optometry, that's the thing that they need to speak loudly and well educated on. It can't be perceived as fear of loss of a revenue. It is about the sanctity and the importance of the comprehensive eye exam and the quality of the eye exam to make sure that that's not compromised. And I think as long as we are clear in terms of what our commitments are and what could potentially be at risk, but I think it's got to be fact-based as well too. I think AI has a role to play, just to be super clear, but the AI isn't replacing the optometrist. I think it's enhancing what the optometrist can do on behalf of the patient and for the patient.
Got it. As you may know, Rick, there's various incentives being thrown around, whether it's just high salaries or signing bonuses or forgivable loans, things like that, to help attract these young doctors. And again, on the surface, initially, I thought that's fantastic. But as I thought about it a little more, I wondered, and please just putting this out there as my thoughts, and I'd love for you to just share if what you think of it. It's not exactly phrased as a question, but my thought was, okay, is the young optometrist really the person with the leverage and the power in this situation? Or is it that, the organizations know that the money will help draw them in a certain direction, and it may end up actually clouding their decision, which may affect the trajectory of their career if they end up in a position where, 5 years from now, perhaps they're not so happy or not so fulfilled or not doing something that's helping to kind of help the profession grow. I don't know if you have any thoughts on. I had that sort of conflicting thought in my own mind.
Yeah. Well, boy, I think you're right. I mean, there's. I think I'll step back from it for a second and say we see this, across not just optometry, but we know that there. Employment is not what it was. Certainly, it is. There's high demand. There's signing bonuses going on in multiple industries, and different people with different backgrounds and so forth. So it's not exclusive to optometry, but it is certainly amplified what we're seeing in terms of demand. And so, what does that mean? I think there's. I don't think it's a forever thing, to be quite honest with you, Harbir. I think it's a now thing. The sustainability behind those models, it gets pretty tough. And by the way, we're not participating, so I'm just giving you a personal opinion. But the long-term sustainability of that means that your cost structure goes up. That means how do you offset that? But for the moment, there's a burst capacity need that's required by many others, and so will that impact graduates? It's again, I suppose it could influence them to stay within to maybe not sample the many options available to them. It may target them to stay within a certain model, and I think that's one of the things I found interesting with some optometrists that I know is that they've had different experiences throughout their life. They've been in independent private practice. They've been associated with a lens crafter, but still remained independent. They worked in corporate, for a guy that you and I both know, Dr. Howard Purcell at Nico. I mean, he's done a lot of different things in optometry and as the president of Nico now, but he was in private practice. He is an academic and so forth. And so does that polarize someone to say, I got to stay on this trajectory? I don't know. Maybe it's possible, but again, I truly don't think this is a forever thing. I think it's like employment is in the world in general, or certainly in North America. Employment there's high demand for certain capabilities, and that is a competitive situation. Let me go back and say what I said earlier, though. Optometry is very largely sustainable in terms of demand. I do think that we need to have more optometrists, as long as we don't dilute the caliber of optometrists graduating, because I think eye care and healthcare still has so much potential that there will continue to be a strong demand there. So we do need to solve for the demand side of the equation as far as people are concerned.
All right, Rick, I'll get you out of here on this last question. Important, very important question. Really the core of this whole series of discussions, right? When I put that initial invitation, that call out, I said, I'd sort of touched on that last question. I said, okay, sure, you're throwing money out there to optometrists, or you're doing certain things to help individual optometrists, gain employment and to be financially secure. But ultimately, the question is, what is your organization doing to help support the growth and the strength of the profession of optometry in the long term?
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity to state that. I feel very strongly about this. We're a company that is built on innovation, and it's one of the things. I joined Essilor in 2011, and one of the things that struck me was the depth of innovation that it was created. And I think exactly the same thing I felt about Luxottica in terms of the innovation. And so why is innovation important? It perpetuates the industry. I didn't come from an optical background, so it was hard for me to imagine that eyeglasses that had been around for hundreds of years could actually have innovation associated with them. But then experiencing the continuous progression in terms of the technology, the designs, the AR coatings, and the fashion component of what we do is that we have inspirational brands that make people feel good. They want to be associated with something that's very unique and special to them, whether it's Oakley, Ray-Ban, or we have 30 different brands that we represent, and up and down the value scale as well too, from Prada to Vogue, and Costa, and I could go on and on. But I think that what we try and do is, first of all, create that consumer desire for great brands. When they enter into the practice, we want to make sure that they have choice. So of course, we're known for Verilux, Crizal, Transitions as key brands, and we're very proud of them. But we actually serve the entire market at every price point in terms of lens technology, but we constantly press on innovation. So our investments in myopia, our investments in presbyopia, continuing to find ways of developing therapeutic solutions, that's all built on innovation. And I was always proud to say that we spend between 3 and 4% of our top line as a company. We spend it back into innovation every single year from an R&D perspective. That's huge, and that's more than all of our competitors combined. So we're committed deeply to innovation, but it's not just innovation on the basis of product. And so, but that's what we're known for, of course. But it's innovation, and I talked about it earlier about having innovative solutions for practices to help them succeed in the marketplace. whether it's an integrated supply chain, whether it's the STARS program that Luxottica developed, whether it's our EL360 program that we've developed to help not only in terms of driving a good outcome with the patients in the dispensary, but also offering incremental value to the practice to find ways that we can help them succeed again in the market. That's really where innovation is at the core of what we do, and so that's how I think we add value. We add value, and again, finally, is that we have to. I mean, that's at our roots. So our partnership with Meta on Ray-Ban Stories is it's the tip of the iceberg. That will be another wave of innovation that will come into the industry, and we're deeply committed. And how do we bring that to life? It's not like we're the first people who've integrated something into eyewear, but what we've done is we've chosen Meta and ourselves have chosen each other as partners on this journey. Two very powerful brands with ecosystems. But again, it's not. We're inviting everyone because we're an open network, and I think that will be sort of my closing comment. Is that while we show up in many different ways, we are an open network. Leonardo as a learning platform, which we're extremely excited about. It's open to all. We're trying to play our role, as you stated very accurately, is that we're one of the largest players in the industry. That comes with a responsibility. And the responsibility for us is give vision a louder voice, elevate the industry in ways that we can, create demand and constantly innovate so that we can progress an industry and create value for everyone. And so that's how I think we certainly, and I say this humbly, we try and do it. But from the CEO's office on down, that's what drives us every day is say see more, be more, and live life to its fullest, and it's generally our North Star. So I am personally excited to be on the journey, and I'm sure happy that in 2011 I made a decision to join the optical industry because I think it's an amazing industry and I love being a part of it.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thanks so much for being here, for answering the questions, even some of the more challenging ones, and being open to having that discussion. Thanks again. I appreciate you being on this.
It's my pleasure. And again, thank you for having me, Harbir.
Thanks. All right, guys, there it was. That was the 4th installment of the Future of Canadian Optometry series presented by Aqueous Pharma. That interview was with Mr. Rick Gadd, president of Essilor Canada. And as I mentioned in the intro, I'm sure you took a lot of insight away from that. Rick brings so much incredible insight with so much experience in the industry, from the US to Canada. And I really have felt like I took a lot of information there that I can use to have conversations with our colleagues and hopefully help guide our profession in the right direction collaboratively, all together. And don't forget, we are having these conversations. There's 6 episodes. There's 6 installments of this Future of Canadian Optometry series. This one was the 4th. We have 2 more interviews to go in the coming week. The 5th installment is with Mr. Alfonso Cerullo, who is the president of Lens Crafters in North America. And the 6th and final installment is a great interview with Dr. Carrie Salzberg, who is an independent practitioner, independent optometrist, to talk about how we can, as independent ODs, as associate ODs, really be successful and help to guide our profession in the right direction. So make sure you stay tuned. And again, don't forget to share this. Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever you live, wherever you spend your time, call a friend and let them know that this conversation is happening. As always, I'm always very open to your feedback. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are so we can continue to have these conversations and hopefully bigger and better conversations over time right here on the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast. I'll see you in the next episode.